where we celebrate resilience, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. I'm your host, Rana. Every episode, we meet someone who's faced unimaginable challenges and found a way to move forward. Today's guest is truly extraordinary. Noor Al-Nasi is a survivor of the Syrian civil war, a conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions. Noor escaped the violence, endured unthinkable hardships, and is now using her voice to inspire others. Noor, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. It's an honor to share my journey.
Let's start at the very beginning. Can you take us back to life before the war? What was it like growing up in Homs?
Really, it feels like another lifetime now. Homs was beautiful. It, it was filled with vibrant markets, the smell of spices and fresh bread filling the air, and the neighbors who felt like extended family. My family ran a small bakery, and every morning I'd wake up to the sound of my father kneading dough. And I remember how much I loved walking to school with my brother. We'd buy roasted chickpeas from a street vendor and try to guess the answers to our math problems before we got to class. Life was simple. It was honestly normal.
It sounds so warm and full of life. When did you start noticing things were changing?
It began with whispers, people talking about protests, disturbance in other parts of the country. At first, it felt distant, like it wasn't going to touch us. But by 2012, the war reached Homs, and suddenly everything we'd known was gone.
What was the moment when it became real for you?
I'll never forget the day our neighborhood was shelled. It started with distant booms, but they got closer and closer. And my father told us to get to the basement, but we didn't make it in time. The bakery was it, and my father didn't survive. I still remember standing in the rubble, unable to process what had just happened. We had no time to grieve, and my mother grabbed me and my brother, and we ran. That was the last time I saw our home.
I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. What happened next?
We joined the wave of people fleeing the city. It was chaos, crowds of families carrying whatever they could, the sound of fighter jets overhead, and the constant fear of being stopped at a checkpoint. We eventually made it to a refugee camp in Lebanon.
I've read so much about the camps, but hearing it firsthand is different. What was life like there?
It was both a nightmare and a strange kind of community. We lived in a tent, surrounded by thousands of others who'd lost everything. There was barely enough food or clean water, and sickness spread quickly. But at the same time, there was kindness. People shared whatever little they had. I remember an elderly woman who taught me to sew using scraps of fabric. Who taught me to sew scraps of fabric. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to focus on, something to keep my mind busy when my mind was overwhelmed.
Despite all that, you found a way to survive and even thrive. What was the turning point for you?
In 2015, we were given the chance to resettle in Canada. I'll never forget stepping off the plane into freezing temperatures and thinking this is the beginning of something new. But it wasn't easy. I didn't speak English and I felt like an outsider. I struggled in school, but my teachers were patient and I started keeping a journal, writing down my feelings, my memories, and my dreams. That journal became my lifeline, really.
That's incredible. What did you write about?
Everything, the people I'd lost, the things I missed, and even the small moments of joy I'd found along the way. Writing helped me process my grief and gave me a sense of control in a world that had felt so chaotic. And eventually, I started sharing my stories. At first, it was just for myself, but then I realized that people needed to hear them. War isn't just about statistics, it's about lives and about families.
You've turned your pain into a purpose. Tell us about the work you're doing now.
I speak at schools, community centers, and even corporate events. I share my story to help people understand what refugees go through and inspire them to show compassion. I also mentor students. I help them navigate their new lives. And when I see someone's face light up because they've learned a new word or felt understood, it reminds me of why I keep going.
Noor, your journey is so inspiring. Before we wrap up, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from your story?
It's simple. Kindness saves lives. During the worst times, it was small acts of kindness that kept me going. A stranger giving us food, someone teaching me a skill, or even just a smile. You don't need to change the world to make a difference. Start with the person in front of you.
Thank you, Noor, for sharing your story with us. You reminded us all of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into Still Standing. If Noor's story resonated with you, please share this episode with someone who needs a little hope today. And remember, no matter what life throws our way, we're still standing. Until next time, take care.